Bore da, good morning everyone and welcome to day 3 of the Cymorth Cymru annual conference. I hope you've enjoyed the last couple of days and are looking forward to the sessions that we've got ahead of us today. One of the issues that's come up in a few of the sessions so far have been about our incredible workforce who have done such an amazing job, particularly during the pandemic, keeping people safe and continuing to provide invaluable support when lots of other services shut down. However, the last 2 years have also been extremely challenging for many frontline workers, and I know that many are experiencing significant fatigue alongside the vicarious trauma that we know has always been there in their day-to-day work, but I think has been intensified during this last 2 years. I'm absolutely delighted that we've got this session that's focused on this really important issue, where we'll hear from a range of different people, but also reflect on some of the views of frontline workers. We're going to be joined by Clare Budden, who is Chief Exec of Clare Budden, but also importantly Chair of the Welsh Government's Workforce Task and Finish Group, which is taking forward this agenda. We're also hearing from Joy Williams from the Housing Support Network, who'll be reflecting the views of a range of people working in local government, housing and homelessness teams. And last but certainly not least, we're going to be hearing from Lee Ball, who many of you will know from his work with the Salvation Army, but I know a number of you are familiar with him as one of our PATH trainers, who's been helping us to embed and influence in terms of psychologically informed approaches across the homelessness and housing support sector over the last few years. So a real range of expertise there, and we're really looking forward to hearing from each of them. There will be a Q&A when we've heard from each person, so please do use the Q&A chat box to the side of your screen and get your questions in for the panel. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Clare Budden, who's going to talk to us a bit more about the Welsh Government Workforce Task and Finish Group. Clare, welcome.
Bore da pawb, good morning, and thank you, Katie, for asking me to come and talk to the conference this morning. I really do appreciate it. And I must also start by saying a big thank you to all of those people who've worked in our homeless services over the course of the last 2 years. The work you've done has been incredible and has made a fantastic and significant difference to people's lives at a really, really challenging time. And I say that both because I've been a homeless worker myself, but also at Clare Budden, we employ several hundred staff who work in our homeless services. So I've seen directly the impacts that the pandemic has had and how people have just stepped up to the plate and just, I can only say, cracked on and done the day job, when lots of us, people like me, were able more easily to work safely from home. I think the other thing to say is thank you for everyone who's contributed and given their feedback, both via the Frontline Network and also via the WLGA work. That work is really influencing the recommendations that we're taking forward to Welsh Government. So the Housing Action Group started its work, it's probably 4 years, 3 years ago maybe now, and we produced 3 reports, which I was delighted that Welsh Government accepted the recommendations around what needed to change across Wales to end homelessness. And during that first phase of work, again, there was some consultation undertaken with people working directly in the sector. And I think one of the things that was extremely powerful that came forward was some really strong views around us needing to have a workforce which is and feels appropriately valued and supported. So when I was asked to chair the Workforce Task and Finish Group, I can't underestimate how significant I knew that role was in coming up with some firm recommendations that, again, we hope that Welsh Government is going to listen to and act on. But the 3 reports that were produced initially around workforce came up with, I think, 4 key areas: that we need appropriate pay and recognition, that we recognise the competencies that staff who work in our homeless services have. Secondly, we need far better job security and career opportunities. We need better and accredited training, and we need more time and resource for supervision, therapeutic support and reflection. So with that in mind, the Workforce Task and Finish Group has brought together a number of people, both from local government, from housing associations, from Cymorth, from Welsh Government, to start to take forward and come up with some really firm proposals around those areas. And we've got 5 areas that we're working on now, which reflect those 4 things I just referred to. And I'm just going to briefly chat you through each of them. talk to you about, I guess, where I see those work streams going, and then to talk, I guess, finally about the one area which I think hopefully is going to be the significant game changer for us all for the future. So in terms of pay and career progression, firstly, Welsh Government have agreed to fund some independent work so that we can benchmark across different roles across Wales that look at the skills and competencies people have to come up with a framework around what pay ought to be for these job roles. So let's have a look at jobs in probation, let's have a look at how jobs in general housing management, let's have a look at jobs in care, so that we can see how we can come up with a pay framework that properly recognises the skills that all you guys have working in our homeless services. The second theme is around qualifications and accreditation. And again, Welsh Government have agreed to fund some independent work around that to help draw up something which recognises the on-the-job experience and skills that people have, but also, where appropriate, has a recognised competency framework and or training and qualification framework where people are recognised for the job skills and experiences that they bring. So those are the first two areas of work. The third one is looking around developing some really good practice across Wales around reflective practice, trauma-informed work and psychologically informed work. And I think it's fair to say that a number of organisations have already started to put that in place. But what we know is what's available across Wales is very different. What some organisations can provide at the moment is quite generalist. So maybe somebody that works as a housing officer may be offered something quite similar to somebody that works in homelessness services. And we know that that's not necessarily always specialist enough for these roles. So we want, again, to develop some best practice that all organisations across Wales are able to follow. We also know that we need to promote the sector better. We know how rewarding jobs can be in homeless services. We're talking a lot today around maybe what needs to change to support the sector better, but actually the work can be incredibly rewarding, and yet we're not always able to attract and bring people into the sector. So how can we develop some better best practice around recruitment and retention so that people really understand the value that these jobs bring, and also really opens up our recruitment to people who bring skills from other sectors and other life experiences. I guess for me, the game-changing piece of work is the one we're going to do last, which is around commissioning. And our aim is to develop some commissioning best practice that we want Welsh Government to accept needs to be part of the commissioning framework across the whole of Wales. So you'll know that services get tendered, and traditionally it can be the case that, maybe I'm oversimplifying, but the cheapest price wins, which has forced many providers over the last few years sometimes to cut staff pay or to offer only statutory terms and conditions to staff. We want this to change. So what we want is to take out some of the things that have led to some of these challenges out of the tendering process. So we want there to be this recognised pay framework that assumes that any provider is going to pay their staff a good rate of pay for the work that they do. We want contracts to build in funding that allow staff to have time out for training, time out for reflection, time out for trauma support where that might be needed, and that needs to be just built into contracts as a standard. We also want to make sure that there's proper funding in place in all contracts for the psychologically informed support and reflective practice that sometimes is needed. The whole job security situation has got to change as well. So we want to see contracts awarded over a much longer period of time so that people are able to be offered more permanency around their job security. We know that's one of the factors at the moment that means that people can't afford to or want to move out of the sector to somewhere where they've got a lot more certainty. And that's wrong, and it just needs to change. So if all those things are built into our contracts, then what we will be doing is tenderers in local government will be making decisions on quality and value added, more on a contract evaluation that might be drawn more to looking at price. So I'm feeling really quite optimistic about the work that we're doing. And I think because under Julie James's leadership, the Welsh Government has accepted the first 3 reports, has set up the advisory board, and we've now got these task and finish groups underway. So it feels to me that we're in a great place at the moment to come forward with some really excellent recommendations, informed by our workforce, informed by you, informed by what you're telling us, that I hope is really going to lead to really lasting positive change for the workforce across Wales, but also is going to help to keep us moving on that journey of ending homelessness. I'll be happy to take your questions later. I'll hand back to Katie now.
Thank you very much, Claire. Really, really brilliant to hear from you at the start of this session, because I think the establishment of that workforce task and finish group was so important as one of the priorities that Welsh Government agreed to take forward. And, you know, being involved in it under your leadership and see all the work that's going on in the different subgroups is absolutely fantastic. So thank you very much indeed for kicking us off. I'm going to take the floor for a short while now to tell you a little bit about our frontline network that we run across Wales. We established this back in the autumn of 2020, and we've been absolutely overwhelmed by the response from frontline workers and the engagement that we've had from them. So firstly, I wanted to say thank you to all of the frontline workers across Wales who have been engaging with that network, who have been sharing their views and their experiences, some very positive, you know, some that are quite traumatic, but being really honest about their experiences and really contributing to the conversations that we're having on a national level. And I also wanted to say thank you to the leaders and managers who are at this conference, who have encouraged and enabled their staff to take time out to attend those network meetings. Some of the feedback that we've had is that for the first time, frontline workers feel that their voices are being heard on a national level and that they're having a real opportunity to influence policy. So thank you to the organisations that have encouraged and empowered their staff to do that. When we were engaging with the workforce task and finish group, at the very first meeting, we really strongly advocated for engagement straight away with people working in frontline roles. As much as many of us will try and reflect the experiences that we're told about and that we know that frontline staff go through, we thought it was really, really important to do a piece of engagement work that heard from them directly. And I'm going to talk you through some of the kind of the highlights of that research and how that's contributed into the work of the group. So we spoke to over 50 frontline workers from a range of different organisations, including third sector support providers, housing associations and local authority staff, working in a variety of different roles across the homelessness, housing and support sector. We first of all asked them about what they enjoyed about their job, and the overwhelming response was about making a difference. People said, the reason I stay is because I love it. It's the best job I've ever had. I love to see people able to move on and continue with their lives. Someone else said, the ability to help someone set up their own place and feel confident is the reason why I do this job. A sense of achievement and worth. We certainly don't do it for the money, which I think leads us on to some of the reasons that I'll talk about later around what's not so great about these jobs. Another common theme that came up was about the variety and challenge. So people really enjoyed learning something new every day, working with different partners, and the feeling that every day was different. People said, I like the variety of people, the variety of challenges. No one day or hour is the same. What keeps me going are the occasional successes we have, and we're always learning. This line of work is interesting, challenging, never boring, and it can be rewarding. So those were some of the things that frontline workers spoke really passionately about their job, and certainly the things that they want to continue doing, and the things that keep them going. When we asked them about the less good things about their job, about the things that they found challenging, a lot of people talked about the pressure and the risk and the complexity. And I think a lot of people reflected on the past 2 years, the conditions during the pandemic. They were incredibly proud of what they'd achieved, but certainly felt that caseloads has increased, that the people that they were supporting were experiencing loneliness, frustration, boredom, poorer mental health as a result of the pandemic, and also the lack of accommodation, permanent accommodation, and difficulty accessing other services was making it really difficult for people to feel positive about their engagement. A lot of frontline workers said they were very close to burnout, and I've certainly had conversations with frontline workers and team leaders myself in recent weeks who've worked in the sector for 30 years and have just found the last 2 years far too difficult and are thinking about leaving. And that had never crossed their mind in the past. But the last 2 years, I think, have left a really challenging legacy on our workforce. Someone said, this job is harder and more emotionally draining. It keeps you up at night. I don't want to be here so long that I don't care, but I'm waking up at 3 a.m. because I'm worried about the people we are trying to support. It's a tremendous strain. As I said, the lack of resources is a huge concern for many, particularly those who are working in local government, who are often at the sharp end of working maybe in temporary accommodation or housing options and simply not having the permanent accommodation available. Someone said, I need to find temporary accommodation for someone who's been kicked out. Our whole day is negative and I've never been this negative. I feel useless. There's nothing I can do to help them. I want to do a bloody good job, but I'm drained. There are not enough resources to help people and we can't help people. As Claire mentioned earlier, job uncertainty did play a factor in this, and people are acutely aware of the length of contracts, the fact that there's often annual funding associated with the Welsh Government budget. We're obviously entering a three-year indicative budget at the moment, so there's a bit more certainty, but that certainly hasn't been there previously. When we asked them about pay and terms and conditions, there was a really broad consensus. Underpaid and undervalued, someone said, despite dealing with hugely challenging, complex issues. Someone else said low pay pushes us closer to homelessness. Someone said our salaries don't go up with inflation, but our cost of living does. So council tax bills go up, but my wages don't. And I think we know over certainly the decade of austerity that wages didn't go up, that there was a tight squeeze on public sector contracts, and it was really difficult for organisations to award any sort of increase. And it's certainly hitting staff. And this was engagement that we did before the recent cost of living crisis started to emerge in terms of the much higher energy prices. And, you know, why on earth are we in a position where the people who are helping people out of homelessness are being pushed closer to that? There was also an awareness of comparison with other roles in other sectors where maybe either equally complex roles or even less complex roles where the pay was equal or even more. People said if you work in Tesco, you don't have these sorts of issues, but you'll get the same pay or better pay. Someone else said, I'm better off being a delivery driver, more pay, less stress. And someone else said, as a result of the national living wage increases, the housekeeper wage and the support worker wage are only 30p difference. And that person wasn't at all denigrating the role of housekeepers, but they were reflecting on the huge complexity of their role and the comparative wage that they got. What was really interesting from frontline workers is they were acutely aware of the impact of commissioning on wages. Even though they were not responsible for commissioning, they understood that that was driving down wages. So some of the things that Claire has talked about in terms of pay frameworks are really, really important and something that frontline workers definitely wanted the group to look at. I think there was much kind of mixed messages on progression and qualifications. Some people were just really, really happy doing frontline work, didn't necessarily have ambitions to progress, certainly didn't want to lose that face-to-face contact with clients. And others felt that the step up came with more stress, but didn't necessarily get the extra pay that would be needed to kind of compensate for that. So I think when we're talking about pay for frontline workers, there's also an important point about differentials for team leaders and people who are taking on more responsibility, but not necessarily seeing the benefits of that. And qualifications were a real mixed bag. Some people saw the benefit in them. Some people worried that those would be a barrier. In terms of trauma and support, as Claire said, I think this is a really, really important issue for people. And some of the things that we know our workers experience, whether it be sometimes, unfortunately, deaths in projects, sometimes people really struggling with thoughts of suicide, attempts at suicide, talking about, you know, previous abuse and trauma and violence in their lives. And our staff have to deal with some really, really difficult circumstances. I think people highlighted the importance of really good leadership within their organisations from both very senior managers, but also team leaders, but also about brilliant peer support that they get from their fellow workers. And that was just viewed as invaluable. And people said that got us through some of the toughest times over the last 2 years, was having amazing peers who really supported you. When we talked about psychologically informed approaches, there was a real mixed bag, as Claire has indicated. And I think some organisations have managed to find some funding, either from external sources or fundraising, to try and pay for counsellors or clinical practice or reflection. But others have not been able to find that funding. So we've got a real patchwork of approaches. Where people were able to engage in proper reflective practice and get clinical supervision and psychological support, it was seen as hugely, hugely valuable to them. To be able to process, you know, with an independent person who was skilled in those areas, to process some of the secondary trauma they'd experienced was incredibly important. Some interesting feedback was that people who had generic offers through employee assistance schemes just didn't feel that those were adequate for the sorts of roles that they were encountering. They felt that, you know, an employee assistance scheme that was set up for all sorts of different companies where you might be able to talk about some stresses and worries wasn't really the sort of service that they needed when they were dealing with some of the situations that I've outlined in their day-to-day work. We also talked about recruitment and retention, and I'm really pleased that the Welsh Government is about to launch a recruitment campaign. We're working on this with the Welsh Government and their recruitment agency, and as part of that we're going to have a new microsite for homelessness and housing support jobs, and an advertising campaign that directs people towards that website. So we'll be in touch with all of you in the very near future to encourage you to engage with that website, and hopefully that will help us start to attract people from outside of the sector, because I know that recruitment is a massive issue for a lot of people. So in terms of next steps, all of this has been written into a report that's available through the Commonwealth website, and that's been taken really, really seriously by the Workforce Task and Finish group. The group spent 2 meetings considering these findings and really took them very seriously and have formed the workforce priorities around this feedback. So really grateful to Clare for her leadership and other members of the group for having listened so carefully to frontline workers. We're looking to engage with them more in the future, and we're also going to be emailing Frontline Network to see if a couple of frontline workers want to join the Workforce Task and Finish group and have their voice heard around that table. So really pleased to share those voices directly from frontline workers. I hope that's useful for those of you who are leaders and managers in this virtual room to reflect on and take back and consider what you can do in your organisations. But I'm really pleased now to hand over to Joy Williams. Joy is manager of the Housing Support Network, which is all of the local authorities working in homelessness and housing support. And she and her previous colleague Ellie did some fantastic work speaking to them about their experiences. So Joy, I'd love to welcome you to the stage to deliver your presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Katie, and morning, everybody. Yeah, I'm going to talk to you briefly about a piece of work that we did with local authority colleagues, very similar to the piece of work that Katie's just spoken to you about with the Frontline Workers Network. And I don't know whether it's a good or a bad thing, really, that there's quite a few of these reports all saying a very similar thing. I suppose it gives us a consensus to understand that these things are being felt across the sector. But this is a piece of work we did at the end of last year with local authority colleagues, and we devised a questionnaire and sent that out across the sector and had 135 responses from 20 of the 22 local authorities. 34 of those responses were from support workers within local authorities, but the rest were from homelessness caseworkers and people working in homelessness and housing options teams. And again, as Katie has said, a lot of it focused on the demands and pressures of the jobs and the negative impacts of that work and how it really affected people and affected their well-being, and even to the extent of saying, I've considered leaving my job. It's just not what I want to do anymore. So lots of people, practically all, said their caseloads has risen. That 9% actually, when we dug down deeper, is the support workers. So support workers, their caseloads tended to stay the same, but the homelessness officers, their caseloads all rose, and significantly rose over the period since the beginning of COVID. And the nature of those cases has changed too. So we're looking at much more cases coming from evictions, financial hardship, relationship breakdown, lots of domestic abuse, people then in hidden homelessness presenting, and a lot more of those cases having more complex and multiple needs as well, which are obviously more difficult for people to deal with. About half of the people said that currently their caseload was manageable, and again about half said that they could currently deliver the service that people needed. But what they said was, we're on a tipping point. There's going to come a point very soon where that's not going to be the case anymore. I'm tipping into not being able to manage what I've got on my plate. So these are some of the quotes that came through from that work about people's thoughts and feelings about their workload and the job that they were doing and how it's impacted on them. Lots and more of their time was focused on that sort of process stuff and recording of stuff, because the numbers were so high, and then they didn't have the time to focus and spend actually helping people to get where they wanted to get. So that part of the job has really sort of been removed, and there's just not enough time in the day to do the work that they need to do. Working from home generally has been seen as a benefit by most people. About 3/4 said that they preferred working from home and they found it beneficial, improving their work-life balance, making it possible for them to do other tasks and have that flexibility. I think particularly during the sort of more stringent lockdown times, that flexibility around childcare, being able to sort of perform those family tasks during your working day with other people in the home was seen as really beneficial. However, lots of people then, and that sort of sense that I'm here in my home and it's quiet and I can just focus on what I need to do. Not everybody felt like that though. And there were downsides that were also represented in the responses, where people felt that their home was now not their own. My work is intruded into my home life and I can never get away from it. I'm working because it's here to do and I just don't stop. And that sort of feeling of, the pressure of not wanting to stop working, the fear of guilt of taking a break, and also that sort of isolation of not being able to have those water cooler conversations with colleagues and just sound somebody out on a particular issue or share an issue with somebody quickly in an office environment. You're kind of stuck with it in your home and you're dealing with it yourself and you're internalizing it because there's nowhere else for it to go. And that intrusion into your home and your family space was really felt by a lot of people. So here are some of the comments around what people felt about working from home. And that balance, getting that balance right around, I've got this greater flexibility, it fits more with my family, I'm able to concentrate better, however, it impacts on my work-life balance and my home doesn't feel like my own anymore. So a real mixed picture there. And when we talked about job satisfaction, it's really important that we've got these reports that can feed into that workforce development group. So we've got the evidence to say, this is what people are telling us. This is the reality of it. This is what is happening. So about half of the people who responded said that they didn't have a sense of satisfaction from their work anymore. People saying, I came into this sector or I did this job because I wanted to help people. I wanted to make a difference. And I just can't do that. The difference that I used to be able to make isn't there anymore. I've lost all satisfaction in my work, and it's negatively impacting on my well-being. When you can't provide a solution to somebody who is coming to you for help, it really has a massive impact on your sense of worth and well-being, unless you can sort of offload that somewhere. However, what we did find was that there's a terrific amount of support out there for people, and people recognise that. I know I can get the support if I need it. I know my managers understand and they will listen. And particularly within local government, there's these schemes and support mechanisms for people should they need some sort of support. But as Katie has said, sometimes that support doesn't fit the bill, because the things that we hear and see in a housing and homelessness setting are sometimes quite traumatic and very specifically related to those housing issues, whereas the support is very generic. And I think there's a gap there in provision for people around something that's more job specific or more sector specific. In contrast to that, then we see this over half of the people had considered leaving their role. And when we're in a period where recruitment is really difficult and retention is hard, what we don't want to do is de-incentivize people so that they are considering leaving their role and leaving the sector, because we need to keep those experienced individuals. What their experiences and their knowledge is really important, and it matters. So how do we keep hold of that expertise? And people talked about, they expanded on the effects on their well-being. This idea that the job is rewarding and purposeful, and being able to help people is empowering, and it matters to people. Doing a good job, finding a solution, helping somebody to move from a period of perhaps disorder to order, or finding that home and settling somebody is really rewarding and satisfying. But people are finding that maybe that's not the case anymore, and these negative effects on people's mental health and well-being came through quite strongly. In some points, it was quite hard to read the responses because of some of the things that people were saying, and I think the impact on even Ellie and myself, sort of researching. Ellie would say, I have to step away from it for a little while sometimes, because the negative emotions are quite strong, and the sense that it shouldn't be like that. People shouldn't be suffering because of their work in this way. So we collated all of those thoughts and feelings, and here are a few of them in their own words. Again, reflecting on what Katie said, I'm overworked, I'm undervalued, I'm underpaid, and I'm undersupported. To be honest, I almost hate the job I used to love. And when people are saying that, we have to stop and take stock and do something about it. And this idea that the resources aren't there for me to deliver what I want to deliver. People were saying, what needs to change? We need more staff across the board, in generic roles, in very specific roles, particularly with these complex needs that people are presenting with. Because what people are saying is, I don't have the skills and the knowledge to deal with somebody who's got quite intense mental health issues. We need those very specific roles within teams. So those roles across the board. That increase in resources, we know this too well. We need more temporary accommodation. We need more settled accommodation options, and we need more specific services for people who've got those particular needs. We need to be able to support people who come through to our services in order to help them to move on. And if we're going to continue to work from home or have a hybrid option, we need to have resources tailored to meet the needs of people working from home. So a decent Wi-Fi connection, the right equipment to do the job that you need to do properly. Sometimes people felt that they didn't always understand what they were being asked to do. Guidance was changing. It looks like legislation will be changing, and that clarity around, okay, so what is it that I need to deliver? How does that translate operationally, and how do I do that? So clarity around that. And this shared understanding across partners, between partners, of what the role is and how we deliver on that, so that we're in this together and we're delivering and working together. So what did we do about that? Because that in itself, if we stop there, it's not a great story. So as a housing support network, we pulled colleagues together and we supported managers to say, how best can you take some of this forward now? How can you support your teams to become more satisfied, to ease the burden of work, to support them in some of the things that they're hearing? And we held a webinar at the end of last year, beginning of this year. Sorry, time flies. And one of the highlights of that webinar actually was hearing from a gentleman called David Beanie. If any of you have heard or know of David, an absolutely exceptional speaker on mental well-being. And David led managers through a kind of process of looking after their own mental well-being and what kinds of things we need to make sure are in place to look after ourselves and protect ourselves. And then from that position, how we then can check on our colleagues and team members to ensure that they are also looked after and well and supported. And we had lots of really practical, positive takeaway points from him. And I would really urge anybody who's looking for some input around mental wellbeing to look at David's stuff and contact him, because they were just really, really well received, and an excellent speaker around this subject, and lots of just very practical, helpful tips to support ourselves. But then we heard from one another around some of the good stuff that's happening across the sector, and we looked at some reflective practice that's going on within local authorities and how that's being built into the work of the team to support one another in managing cases and improving their practice, building on that reflection. We looked at the role of wellbeing champions and this idea of just listening to one another and supporting one another within the workforce. These were examples from across the sector. They're not local government examples. We looked at one organisation's journey to psychologically informed practices and how they've built that into their way of working. And we looked at how one local authority has learnt from its experiences during COVID and will take those forward and develop those. And lots of really good stuff actually that's going on across the sector to help to improve the mental well-being of staff and hopefully therefore help them to cope with their workload. So lots of food for thought there for people to take away and take back to their own teams and begin to implement locally. And all of this research, as I've said, is feeding into that work of the workforce development group so that we can eventually take this forward nationally and improve the experiences of all of our staff across the country. So thank you for listening, and take your questions later. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joy. Really, really valuable insight there. And as you said, lots of common themes with the work that we did through the Frontline Network Wales, but some incredibly important voices to hear from local government who have been under huge pressure and continue to be under huge pressure. Our final speaker for this session is Lee Ball. As I said, many of you will know Lee from our PATH training and benefited from his experience and expertise. But Lee's day job is working for the Salvation Army, and he works across the different nations of the UK and has a vast array of experience. So Lee, invite you to share your reflections on this topic.
Hello Katie, hello everyone. First of all, thank you for having me and let me have the opportunity to speak today and to say thank you as well for the work that's been done over the last couple of years and for all the years leading up to that. This is a really difficult job to do that you guys do, and the last couple of years has really laid bare quite what a difficult time that's been to do that job in as well. I'd like to thank Claire, Katie and Joy as well. I think there was some really encouraging stuff in Claire and Katie's presentations as well as in Joy's, but some really hard-hitting facts and feedback to hear as well. What really struck me in Joy's is 77% of all the workforce believe that the work impacts their well-being, and that's really, really hard to hear, and I think drives us, not just as an organisation, but as a sector, to try and do something about this. I think what COVID has done is really laid bare quite how difficult a job this always was, and then made it even more so difficult past that point. You get an immense feeling of the workforce being really overwhelmed, really stretched, not just the workforce, but the sector as well, completely past its capacity and past the resources that we've got to hand. And I think that's really impacted people's real desire, and you can see that in the other presentations, to deliver the best support that they can. As Katie said, my work takes me across the whole of the UK. And there's something really, really unique about the work that's done in Wales and the relationships that people have in Wales and the desire and passion that exists in the Welsh workforce to deliver the best services we possibly can. Now, this is in the light of, I think, in the face of a second really, really serious pandemic, a pandemic of toxic stress, vicarious trauma, and all the kind of co-occurring mental health problems that go with that and the challenges that go with that. The threat to the mental health of our communities and to the workforce at the moment runs really, really deep. It's really far-reaching. It's not just affecting our workforce, but millions of people across the planet. You can feel this globally at the moment, that level of kind of toxic stress and trauma that people are experiencing. It's left people feeling really vulnerable. We're seeing a huge rise at the moment in problematic use of certain substances, certain behaviors as a way of coping with trauma, a way of coping with stress, a way of coping with loneliness and isolation. We've got a workforce that have lost loved ones in the height of the pandemic, who faced heightened anxieties of becoming sick themselves or of carrying illness home to their family, to their dependents. And then we've got people facing the dire consequences of the pandemic as well. And I think in this kind of recovery phase of the pandemic, it's really, really important that the mental health of the workforce, and I used healthcare workforce because I think those working in housing is the biggest influence on health and well-being. The mental health of those workers who are doing this job and our response to it can't be overlooked. It has to be of primary importance at this moment in time. We've got a situation where 1 in 6 workers across the general population is dealing with heightened levels of anxiety and stress at the moment. And that's not particular to the sector. If you think about the sector and the work that you guys do, that's going to be considerably higher. Now, this has a huge impact on someone's ability to perform at their best. And you can see that in the feedback, I think, from the previous presentations about how that impacts people. It doesn't just stop people performing at their best, but the situation, the vicarious trauma, the lack of resources, the toxic stress levels that we've got at the moment contributes to the ill health of the worker and the workforce and of entire communities. If we think about it, humans and communities, they're organic beings. If one part of that system goes out of equilibrium, becomes unwell, that's going to affect the entire system. When we think about the situation that we're in, and not just within kind of support providers situation, but across the sector, and I'd work with a number of different support providers, and everybody is saying the exact same thing. We're in the middle of a community and public health crisis here. It's going to take an entire community. There was a gentleman called Wolf once who said that it takes an entire community to bring themselves out of a traumatic situation where everybody has the right to contribute to the well-being of everyone. And at this time, we need everybody to be feeding into this. If we're not well, we're going to really struggle to contribute to the healing of those people around us. I think as a support provider and as a member of a sector, we know that people perform better when they're healthy, when they're motivated, and when they're focused. And therefore, if we are a smart and compassionate sector and provider, we are going to support our employees. We're going to support those people who are experiencing vicarious trauma, toxic stress, to cope and recover. The support, when we think about the support that people receive from employers and the sectors that they work in, this is key in determining how well and how quickly we're able to kind of bounce back to get to that peak performance that the people that we serve really, really need us to be in. Standing by people when they experience trauma and stress is not about keeping hold of a staff member. It's not about winning contracts. It's not about doing any of those things. It sends a message about our values as a support provider or an organization and as a sector. All of us, frontline workers especially, but all of us, all of the frontline workers, all of the managers need to see that the sector that they work in, that the organizations that they work for lives out its values, treats its people well, understands the stresses and the strains of doing this type of work, and understanding what it feels to feel like when you don't make a difference. The organization needs to see the sector, or our organizations need to see the sector and those commissioning these models or the way that we work actually modeling this model as well, treating people well and treating people fairly. And it's really nice to hear Claire, I think, come up with some of the recommendations that she spoke about earlier. Because when you think about it, safety, trust, sincerity, cultural competence, honesty, integrity, these are the key drivers of psychologically informed environments and psychologically informed ways of working. It's the key kind of components of a psychologically informed sector and a workforce and of engagement, which is exactly what we want to achieve with the people that we work with. As a sector and the organisation within it, if staff kind of reap the rewards of this kind of healthier way of working, of more sustainable communities, what we're going to see is an increased sense of morale, of effectiveness, and of job satisfaction as well, which touches really on what Joy was talking about. At the end of the day, we all have mental health. It moves up and down on a spectrum from good to poor, and over the last 2 years, it can swing as quickly as that. As we know, it's affected by a range of factors, both in and outside of work. So I think to be starting this conversation and to be having this with the workers across the sector is absolutely important. And obviously, it doesn't have to be difficult. The exposure to abuse, to neglect, I think to discrimination and violence, and all those adverse experiences that people within the work, the people who are in our services experience, and the workforce also has a history of experiencing. We know from the ACES study, this has a lifelong potential to affect the health and well-being, not just of this generation, but of future generations as well. And we've got 40 years of kind of research from the ACES study that demonstrates this. Because of that ACES study and other subsequent similar research pieces, it's really, really important that the policymakers, providers, organizations, the sector increasingly recognizes that this exposure to traumatic events, and bearing in mind that there's a real high prevalence of people who come to this work with a history of trauma. 85% of people who do this type of work will experience a traumatic event in work who do this as well. That exposure to traumatic events, and certainly from the clients that we work with and from a lot of the workforce, when that happens in childhood, it heightens the service users and the general community's negative health outcomes across the life course. As our sector, both in housing and health, as we become more aware of trauma's impact, we're realizing the true value of psychologically informed approaches to work and how effective this is. Psychologically informed support really, really acknowledges the need to understand a person's life experiences, to deliver effective support. And this has the potential to really increase engagement, adherence to treatment, health outcomes, and really importantly, the wellness of staff as well. Within a psychologically informed environment, what you have is a set of evidence-based approaches which are underpinned with opportunities for reflection that can clearly demonstrate effective outcomes for service users and staff with trauma histories. But we need to do more, and it's really, again, encouraging to hear both Claire and Joy talking about the need to develop a more integrated, comprehensive approach that ranges from these evidence-based approaches to trauma, and also to measuring quality outcomes and preparing staff and making the staff enabled and equipped with the knowledge to be able to do this type of work as well. So there are questions that remain for the sector and how to conceptualize trauma, how to really understand it, and to continue to develop and really importantly deliver on some of the issues that Joy that Claire spoke about earlier as well. When we think about the workforce and that daily kind of experience of working alongside people who have experienced trauma, it puts clinical and non-clinical staff at a risk of this kind of secondary trauma, toxic stress and vicarious trauma. We're seeing issues as within the organisation that I work for, and I've seen this across a number of different organisations, where we're seeing symptoms such as chronic fatigue, disturbing thoughts, poor concentration, cynicism, emotional detachment, exhaustion, avoidance, people staying off work, people struggling to take annual leave. This is creating physical illnesses. And if staff are experiencing that, they're really going to struggle. And we've seen this to deliver the quality of care that they're so passionate about being able to deliver. And as all of the talkers, all of the speakers today have spoken about, this leads to huge issues with staff turnover. That's going to create a negative feedback loop, because if people are watching and listening to these stories of what it's like to do this work, we're going to really struggle to have a future-facing workforce if we don't do something about it now. As I said, many of us have our own histories of personal traumas, which can be exacerbated by this constant secondary narrative of hearing the trauma stories of other people. Preventing vicarious trauma and starting to work on this in a comprehensive and integrated systemic way is going to increase staff morale. It's going to allow staff to optimize the way that they deliver services, allow them to reconnect with the work that they do, which is really, really important, and hopefully allow them to re-experience a sense of safety, and to reduce the expense of constantly regurgitating and reformulating your workforce. Strategies that we've seen from a provider that are really, really effective in doing this is training, making sure that and we can go to the 5 kind of key principles within a PIPE framework: the importance of relationships, the importance of connection, the importance of training, and having conversations around trauma, burnout, and the importance of psychologically informed environments as well. It's about offering opportunities for staff to really explore their own trauma histories, making sure that we support and we embed into the commissioning process opportunities for reflection, making sure that there's little things like the encouraging of incentivizing physical activity within workforces, and thinking about mental health kind of wellness days as well. I think it's really important that as leaders and decision makers, we have this real need to realize the crucial importance of value of investing in the mental health of our workforce, as well as the personal and the economical and societal benefits of doing so. I think we need to learn from our past, to thank the essential workforce that we've got, to acknowledge them, to be able to deliver the things that they need, and demand and promote real reforms within our system. We simply cannot afford to deliver on this aim. And I think, to kind of wrap it up in the words of Vincent Felitti, people can and do recover. And if we want to promote this, if we really want to support this, and I'm sure we absolutely all do, both staff and service users, the health and well-being of communities is really, really important to us here in Wales. As Vincent Felitti said, we just need to love more and stress less, and hopefully build systems that are conducive to doing so as well. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for having me. I'll leave it there. Katie, if you're okay to come back in.
Thank you very much, Lee. And I'd like to welcome back the rest of the panel at this point. As ever, Lee, some brilliant insight there, and a specific focus on trauma and the impact on not only the people that we support, but also the staff working in these positions. And firstly, Lee, I guess, we're having conversations at the moment about, what should that psychologically informed approach look like for staff? And I know those conversations are ongoing, but from your perspective, Lee, reflective practice everywhere, clinical support where it's needed, is that the sort of thing that you think is an absolute baseline?
People need to be able to talk about how they feel. I think when we know that safety is absolutely paramount to reducing the impact of trauma and hopefully stopping it being experienced by people, we can't have a workforce that feels unsafe trying to make other people feel safe. And I think the acquisition and that experience of safety within a peer group, being able to talk about how the work affects you, how you're feeling both in and out of work, I think those things are absolutely vital. And that's what kind of reduces that stress response, that fight or flight response in staff, so that they're able to best deliver the services to people. And how do we do that? We do that by connecting with how we feel, by hearing ourselves say it. And you hear yourself say it in reflective practice. It can't be tokenistic. It has to be built in. There has to be the finance, the time, the resource, all put into the commissioning process, so that services are not scrabbling around trying to fit it in because they know it works. It's simply built in. It's the way that we do it.
Yeah, and that goes back to the comments that I think, a few of us made earlier about it being quite a patchwork of responses, and that's often dependent on the size of an organisation, its fundraising ability, whether it can kind of move funding from elsewhere in that organisation. And Joy, I know that you and your network are really supportive of reflective practice, of having clinical supervision where that's appropriate. But from your perspective as local authorities, you're keen to build that into commissioning, but it costs, doesn't it? And that means probably a call to Welsh Government to make sure that this gets properly funded.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we need the sort of the commissioning guidance to say this is important and this needs to be part of provision, and that way, like you say, you can commission services that do that and take account of the cost of that within a tender. So I think, it's really important that sort of these things are led from the top, that we see its importance and we value it at the top, and then that filters through to it being delivered on the ground.
Definitely. And I know, Claire, that's something that you would agree with. And I think that importance of it being reflected within commissioning, but also that leadership from organisations, because we know this isn't just about the relationship between the support worker and the person using the support service. It's about a whole culture and setting that leadership from the top, isn't it?
Absolutely, totally agree. And I think, what's really struck home with me is that many of our staff have got lived experience of homelessness themselves, and they make absolutely excellent support workers because of that. However, you have to recognise that day in, day out, they are reliving their own experience in supporting other people. So I think there's got to be an absolute commitment from the top of organisations. And, I guess it helps if you've worked in homelessness like I have, but you don't have to understand that these jobs are really challenging, can be really rewarding, but we've got to get it right in terms of the support that we provide for people. And too often in the past, and I've seen it in my own organisation, staff have felt that they're just expected to dust themselves off and carry on. And that's not good enough. And we just need to do better as we move forward into the future.
Definitely. And
Katie,
we've got...
sorry, can I speak back into that? Yeah, to say in terms of there is no economic argument that would stand against this, because if you don't pay for that sort of stuff now, you're going to be paying later on tenfold. Mm-hmm. And the workforce that we rely on to do this type of work, who do such valuable work, if we don't support them to be able to do that, we're going to shoot ourselves in the foot for a workforce 5-10 years down the line, because people won't simply come in. And not only that, but I think it speaks into our values. If we're going to profess and talk about how psychologically informed ways of working, and the narrative and the discourse we have is around service users, but we don't employ that to our staff teams, it's going to be really disingenuous, it's going to be insincere, and it's going to scrap the work of everything. This has to be in everywhere, in every direction, and felt by everyone.
Definitely. And one of the comments in the chat bar from Jan is heartening to hear about the recommendations of the working group. We've really struggled with terms and conditions and pay in our sector, and pay rates have been poor, inflation increases aren't enough, and there's no levelling up. So an interesting point here is when there's a kind of flat percentage wage increase, obviously the highest paid workers get a much proportionally, the same, but in real terms, it's much higher wage increase, whereas those who are on the lowest wages don't. And, is there something to think about in terms of, how we really focus on those frontline workers and whether that, there needs to be extra recognition, particularly if we're hearing from frontline workers about them being pushed closer to poverty and to homelessness as well.
I wasn't sure who you were directing that to, but I mean, I absolutely agree, Katie. And I think, it doesn't need to be rocket science, does it? You can have pay increases, not necessarily based on percentages, but based on an amount of money. And we need to be in a situation where we're not pushing people who work for us into poverty. And we know whatever job people are working in at the moment, they're experiencing real challenges in just making ends meet. But we've got to get this right. And I think we need to look at all types of sectors, all types of ways of doing this to make sure that we can get this working much more effectively for our workforce in the future. It's a people-based service, homelessness. Without the people, we can't support the people that we want to. So,
absolutely. And another comment that Jan has made about qualifications is that tension that I think we've talked about in the workforce task and finish group between, that potentially being really beneficial to some people, but for some people it might be off-putting. People who maybe have not had a positive experience in education, who don't want to do something that feels really academic, and be interested in your reflections on that, Claire, and Joy in particular.
I think we've heard that really loud and clear from the Frontline Network and from the feedback from homelessness staff and local government. And there are, we don't have to have somebody attending college every week to get a qualification. We can recognise and value the on-the-job experience and skills and competencies that people have. So I think the assurance I can give to everybody here today is that we are looking at this in its broadest sense.
And I think it's really important, and we've talked in the group as well, around recruiting on values, and that comes first. So we're looking at the values of the individual and how they fit with the organisation, through all of the research as well, that it's people's values that are keeping them there. I came into this job to do something positive and move people on. So we recruit to values, and then we can train people then within the organisation to have the skills, in a sense, to deliver that. So for me, that's the way around it goes.
Definitely. And I think that, the good practice subgroup on recruitment practice is really important, because if we're asking for people to have qualifications and 20 years experience, then that's definitely a barrier to some people who might have brilliant values and brilliant transferable skills and want to come and make a difference. I realise we're about to finish, so just a final quick reflection. I'll go to Lee first. I know you've got to go. What would be your one priority in this area for improving, how the workforce are kind of valued, recognised, supported? If you could kind of make that call to Welsh Government right now.
To put our money where our mouth is and make sure that the resources and the systems that people need to stay healthy to do this work is built into the whole process. That this is not an optional extra. It's not something that's woolly and fancy and nice to do. This is something to keep people well. And the people who've done this job over the last couple of years really deserve the respect to be able to talk about how they feel about that.
Definitely. Thanks, Lee. Joy, your final reflections.
I think there's stuff we can do in the long term, and I think we're working towards that. But I think right here, right now, it's just about being kind to one another and to ourselves. When it starts there for me, when we're kind to ourselves and we look after ourselves, we're then able to be kinder across the sectors, not just within our own organisations or areas of work, but we can, and that for me then will sort of spill out more widely then. So it's about kindness.
Thanks very much, Joy. And Claire, final words from you really in terms of, what you'll be calling for as chair, and how optimistic you're feeling about the impact that the Task and Finish group can have.
The critical one for me, I think, as I said, is around wholly changing the way we commission these services so that we can build in all of the things that all the speakers this morning have referred to and all of the feedback that we've heard from those people working in the sector right now. So get the commissioning changed and we'll be able to deliver what we really need to deliver for our workforce.
Thank you very much. You've all made really fantastic, really valuable contributions, hopefully giving a lot of food for thought for the people in attendance. And I hope that the audience have heard the commitment that we all have as members of the Task and Finish group and members of the subgroups to really work as hard as possible to try and make change happen. I feel that this is the opportunity, an opportunity that's unique compared to anything over the last 10 years with the Homelessness Action Group and the commitment from the Minister. And it's up to us to make sure that those voices are heard and that Welsh Government do what they need to do to secure a valued and resilient workforce into the future. So diolch yn fawr iawn. Thank you very much to all of our panellists. We're taking a break now, but we hope to see lots of you back for a brilliant presentation from the Museum of Homelessness at 12 o'clock. Diolch yn fawr iawn. Thank you very much, everyone.
Diolch.
Bye-bye.